Welcome to Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute, hosted by Georgina Downer. The era of decolonisation in the aftermath of World War II marked the emergence of a new form of sub-military engagement, peacekeeping. Since 1947, Australian peacekeepers have been in the field continuously, from the Middle East, Cyprus, Kashmir, Indonesia, and of course, East Timor, to name but a few. Joining me to discuss the history of Australian peacekeeping is historian Dr Peter Londey. Welcome to Afternoon Light, Peter.
Thanks, Georgina. Pleasure to be here.
It's lovely to have you on the podcast, Peter, and admiring the beautiful view of Delphi in your background, which of course begs the question, as someone who started off life as an ancient historian rather than a Cold War historian or historian of modern Australia, at least, what happened with your academic interest to shift from ancient history to the history of Australian peacekeeping? It's quite a turn, but maybe they're related. It is.
Well, all history is related in one way. Yeah, I started off as a Greek historian, did my PhD on Delphi, had short-term academic jobs, and then the jobs ran out. So I ended up taking a job as a historian at the Australian War Memorial here in Canberra. And it was great that there were jobs as historians in Canberra. And when I was at them, it was a great place to work in lots of ways, and we did lots of different things. But I realised the place was just chock-a-block with people who knew all about World War I and World War II. And I was never going to compete with them with my knowledge of 4th century BC Greece. So, but peacekeeping really was an area that was being a bit neglected, and we'd done a lot of it by that stage. And by chance, I got asked to be the historian curating our very first peacekeeping exhibition in 1993. And it was an exhibition actually paid for quite largely by the Army, the Navy and the Air Force and the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, because at that stage they were very keen to highlight what they were doing in peacekeeping in Cambodia, Somalia and other places. So it got me interested in the subject, and I just realised there was a big gap here. So while I was at the War Memorial, I wrote the first history of Australian peacekeeping, a book called Other People's Wars, which came out in 2004. And then was a senior historian working on later on a much bigger project, the official history of, I can never remember the full title, the official history of Australian peacekeeping, humanitarian and post-Cold War operations, or something along those lines. It's 6 enormous volumes. It must be over 4,000 pages. And I wrote quite a big chunk of the volume, especially the volume which covered all the early period. I wrote a lot of that. And then later had a chance to go back and teach classics again at ANU. So I sort of have one foot in the ancient world and one in the modern world, which it's interesting. Yes, my understanding of ancient history always helps me understand modern history and vice versa. Not because things are the same, but sometimes because you can see the ways in which things are different. Though the ancient Greeks, they never did peacekeeping, but they did have, in the 4th century BC, they actually had a series of common peace agreements where states did all sign up to a thing saying, we won't fight wars with each other. And if one state starts a war, the other states will come and stop them. So the idea of collective security actually did exist in the ancient world. Not very successfully, but at least the idea was there, which I think is nice.
And we'll get on to this, but peacekeeping has also not necessarily been very successful. So the conflicts and failed attempts at keeping the peace have been with us even since the ancient times, I would say.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, no, absolutely. Peacekeeping has had mixed results. It's certainly better, I think, than fighting wars, because wars also have very mixed results and the cost is much, much greater. So peacekeeping is always a cheap alternative to fighting wars. But some conflicts have been settled really well and others are just still festering. So we look at Israel and Gaza at the moment, and that's something the UN took up in the late 1940s and has never been able to solve.
Well, it's interesting, and we'll get on to this, but a lot of the conflicts where there have been peacekeepers are still extant, aren't they? Yeah. In the Middle East, in Israel, Cyprus, Kashmir, all those places still have tensions, and the ultimate question of territorial dispute and the like is unresolved. So, that maybe the peacekeepers are fine at keeping the peace, and not obviously so much in the Middle East these days, but it's resolving the conflict. That's the next step, which is so political. But tell me, Peter, how do you define peacekeeping? Is it in juxtaposition to war, conflict, or is there a nice dictionary definition? It came out of the United Nations, I know, but there's not necessarily anything in the Charter of the UN, is there, about peacekeeping?
Peacekeeping does not exist in the UN Charter at all, which is interesting. When they drew up the Charter in 1945, they very much had their eye on conflicts between State A and State B. And, of course, they'd just gone through World War II. They'd seen Japan before World War II invading Manchuria and China. They'd seen Italy invading Abyssinia. Then they saw the Germans invading numerous places. So that was on their minds, I guess. But in fact, most wars since 1945 have not been of that sort at all. But to define peacekeeping, and I define it as a historian, it's not a legal term at all, but as a historian, I'd say peacekeeping operations have to be in some sense neutral in the conflict. They're not one side or the other trying to impose their will, even trying to impose their will with the best will in the world. So it has to be a neutral intervention. To show that it's neutral, it's pretty well always done by multiple countries. People like the French occasionally go into somewhere in Africa and say, we're here as peacekeepers, but that lacks legitimacy because it's just one country doing it. Peacekeepers are there because of conflict, not because of cyclones or tidal waves. And they're trying to do many different things. They may be trying to avoid conflict flaring up. They may be trying to monitor a ceasefire when people have managed to stop fighting. They'll often be out there negotiating with local commanders to try and stop flare-ups of fighting. But they'll also be helping the population recover from the effects of that conflict. They'll be doing a lot of humanitarian work often, but it is humanitarian work necessitated by conflict. But one of the key things, and I think the key thing which differentiates it from war, is peacekeepers should always use the minimum possible level of violence. They may kill people, but only under very strict rules of engagement. In East Timor, 20 years ago, basically if a militiaman raised his rifle and was threatening to kill either peacekeepers or civilians, the peacekeepers were within their rights to shoot to kill that militiaman. But as soon as the militiaman put the rifle down and turned his back, they were not authorized to shoot. And that frustrated some soldiers who were used to fighting wars or wanted to fight wars where they could kill people. But the minimum use of violence is just a core belief, I think, in peacekeeping and really necessary.
And tell me about the first peacekeeping missions then, Peter. So it's not referenced in the UN Charter. The UN is created and then there quickly exist peacekeeping forces. So this terminology does it come about at that time, or does it take several years to develop the term peacekeeping?
The term peacekeeping takes a while to develop, but the activity, I think I've argued, clearly develops in 1947. There had actually been some peacekeeping, what we would call peacekeeping, under the League of Nations, but in 1945 there was a general amnesia about the League of Nations and people just wanted to put it under the carpet as a failed experiment, even though the United Nations was quite closely modelled on it in structure. But the first United Nations peacekeeping, I've argued, was in 1947 in Indonesia, and there were actually Australians there, so we actually had some of the very first peacekeepers. But what happened was there was a conflict between the Dutch, who were the colonial power in Indonesia, and Indonesian Republicans who wanted independence from the Dutch. The Japanese had occupied it in Indonesia during World War II, but as they left, they allowed the Indonesian Republicans to declare independence. So it's like a little hand grenade thrown into the Dutch colony. And so by 1947, there was a standoff and each side controlled some areas, especially of Java and Sumatra. Then the Dutch mounted a police action, an invasion of Republican territory, and now the world got interested, and both India and Australia referred it to the United Nations, who imposed a ceasefire and set up a diplomatic commission to report on whether the ceasefire was being observed. But at its very first meeting, this diplomatic commission, which included an Australian representative, said, we can't do this by ourselves, just diplomats and their assistants. We need some military officers. who will come in. They're going to be experienced at understanding what's happening on the ground. They'll give us additional numbers. They'll be equipped to work in what was quite a dangerous area because there were still bits of fighting going on. So they called all the member companies of the Diplomatic Commission to send some military officers. And those people, I think, were the first peacekeepers come in. So in a way, peacekeeping is never invented in New York, let alone in San Francisco where they wrote the charter, but it was invented on the ground in Jakarta, basically, where the diplomats realized we can do our job a lot better if we have some military assistance. They're not going to come here to fight, but they're going to be our eyes and ears on the ground, and they will be able to report to us on what's happening. And in the end, the military assistants who were military observers, and I would say peacekeepers, did a lot more than that. They helped repatriate forces who had ended up on the wrong side of the ceasefire line. They reported on humanitarian conditions in villages. They negotiated with local commanders to quell outbreaks of fighting. So they did a huge amount, which their skills as military officers allowed them to do.
There were thoughts, weren't there, and there was an intention that the UN have a standing force that it would be able to send into conflicts to keep the peace. This has never, of course, happened, but you could argue that peacekeepers in the end, through agreements and resolutions at the UN, have almost become a de facto UN standing force, and that there are reliable member states of the United Nations who do contribute, like Australia has, but it's countries like, I think, of Fiji often contributes peacekeepers, don't they?
Pakistan.
Yeah, reliably contribute peacekeepers to conflict zones around the world where they're required and where the UN has authorised. So is this what it has become? Peacekeeping has really become this UN force that never quite existed?
In effect, I think, yes, there was always going to be a UN military staff committee, and the Cold War intervened in that. And I think the Cold War tensions meant that nobody trusted the idea of an actual UN force. So peacekeepers were, in a way, the de facto substitute. And those first peacekeepers in Indonesia established some of the principles which allowed that to work. So after they'd been there for 6 months, the observers themselves, the military observers, had a conference to discuss what they were doing and to set out principles to guide it. And it included things like they should always work in multinational teams. You should never have just a team composed of one nationality. They were impartial. They had no power to tell the inflicting parties what to do, but they needed to try and persuade and convince them. And it explicitly said the observers are not here representing their national governments. They are representatives of the United Nations. And so it did, in effect, say, yes, we are a little mini UN force. And so peacekeeping has always, I think, filled that role, yes.
Do you think that at that early stage that was the reality, though, that the observers were representing the wishes of the United Nations, or were they, in the end, representing the wishes of their particular country?
It's a bit mixed, but by and large, I think they were reasonably representing the United Nations. At the same time, they came from countries which had radically different views about the conflict itself. Australia, under its Labor government, and especially under H.V. Evatt as External Affairs Minister, were very strong in favour of decolonisation, and so they instinctively, in a way, supported the Indonesian side. The British were much more inclined to be on the Dutch side. The relationships with Holland in Europe were important to them. The US, which also had some of the observers, tended to be a bit on the fence and was ultimately the most influential country in the situation. And you get odd cases where observers write reports about there'd been some atrocity or something, and they go to investigate it. And there's one case in particular where there are about 3 different reports written by observers from different nationalities. So they came at it with different views, but I mean, partly that could just be different personal worldviews, but yeah, they do reflect the views of their countries to some extent. So total impartiality is always hard.
Yes.
Australia was there because we wanted Indonesian independence to succeed, in all honesty. But equally, people did their best, and I think when they saw killing happening or whatever, they would stop it regardless.
Obviously, the influence of Doc Evatt, the External Affairs Minister, on Australia's involvement in the UN and these early UN actions is really key. He was a great believer in the United Nations. He was absolutely core to its establishment. what were his and Prime Minister Ben Chifley's pronouncements around this mission to Indonesia? Did they articulate it in terms of Australia's contribution to Indonesian independence, or at least eventual independence, or was it couched in terms about the UN is this new body and has this role to keep peace and stability in the world?
I think Evatt probably did believe the last thing you said, that he was a great believer in the idea of the United Nations. He'd been one of the people at the conference which drew up the charter. He was a true believer in the UN itself. He was later president of the General Assembly and always said that was his proudest position, the position he was proudest of.
That's because he never
but there were other people, I guess. Well, no, he would have liked that. Yeah. But there was also a pragmatic thing there. I think they saw the writing on the wall and thought, Indonesia will be independent. It's going to be our nearest neighbour and we need it to be a friend. Evatt at one stage proposed quite a large buffer force that Australia would provide a big part of, and Chifley was more pragmatic and just said, no, we're getting all our troops home and we're not going to provide that sort of thing. We're trying to demobilise. So the small number of military observers was okay, but a large buffer force was not. So Chifley was quite the pragmatist. The other important person, though, is the Secretary of the Department of External Affairs, a man called John Burton, who was a real idealist, certainly a believer in decolonisation, and whose parents had been missionaries in China. He came at it from quite a radical viewpoint, especially in Australia then, of being very sympathetic to the colonised, very sympathetic with Asian cultures, and he really helped push the cause towards Indonesian independence as much in a way as Evatt himself did. Evatt was off very busy in the 40s trying to solve every conflict in the world. I mean, Evatt had grandiose ambitions. So Australia was involved in the conflict in Greece after the Civil War there. Evatt put himself forward to be a mediator in Kashmir, but people thought he was probably too abrasive for that. And it was partly this view that Australia, as a middle power, it was a sort of view which then I think got taken up much later. Australia as a middle power should be a force for good in the world, and that especially in Asia and the Pacific, we should be the main represent the British Empire. So we should take a leading role ahead of Britain in this region. So there's a whole tangle of motives there in a way.
The election in 1949, of course, marks a change in government from the Chifley government to the Menzies government. Was there a change in approach to these sorts of missions with the change of government, or was there a sustained commitment to peacekeeping, even if it wasn't called peacekeeping back then?
I think there was some sustained commitment, but the motivations for it were very different. And so I think there was an enormous break in 49, really. Menzies had always headed in for the United Nations. He talked in Parliament before the 49 election about how the UN was just a big set of paper shuffling people and we couldn't put our faith in them. In a world where there were real aggressors, this wasn't going to keep us safe. And in fact, at one point he said something that Evatt's enthusiasm for the UN was like marsh lights leading us to our destruction. So it's very strong language. Yeah. That was in Parliament. So I think it's safe to say that a desire to support UN operations didn't really figure after 1949. Evatt had already been involved in some of the negotiations about Kashmir, and that continued under the Menzies government. We sent Sir Owen Dixon to be mediator in Kashmir, unsuccessful as it turned out, but that was significant. And because of that
too, because Menzies had been mentored by Sir Owen Dixon, so there would have been particularly special respect between
absolutely, yeah.
So Menzies would,
and I think Menzies helped choose Dixon for this role for exactly that reason. Yeah, he'd actually been. I don't understand the legal world very well, but he'd been in Dixon's legal office at some stage in his career. Yeah,
yes,
you know more about this than I do.
He had been a junior to Sir Owen Dixon when he was a barrister, when he was a King's Counsel.
Okay. That's right. Thank you. And this ultimately led to us actually providing the commander for the UN military observers in Kashmir. They called originally Major General, later Lieutenant General Robert Nimmo, who was actually commander from 1950 until 1966, until he died still doing it. And the UN loved Nimmo. They thought he was the most successful UN peacekeeper ever at that stage. And he really organised the mission very well, I think. And then we sent observers as well. Probably Nimmo wanted some Australian observers as well. But for Menzies, I think Kashmir was important because it was a conflict between two British Commonwealth countries. He was appalled at this idea of India and Pakistan, these two newly independent countries in the British Commonwealth, fighting each other. And as we know, Menzies was very attached to the Commonwealth, really regarded Britain as a more important ally than the US, possibly unlike some of his foreign ministers, but his external affairs ministers. So it was partly seen as a Cold War conflict. They didn't like this idea of conflict among our allies, and there was always this threat that this could let communism in, and it was a British Commonwealth matter. So the fact that it was a United Nations operation, I think, just had no weight for Menzies, probably.
Yes, so you're saying he saw it through the lens of an intra-Commonwealth conflict
rather
than as a threat to global peace and security, and therefore something that the UN had an interest in and therefore established this mission, which, I mean, in the end, the outcome is the same. If it had been Chifley or Menzies, they still were contributing to this mission, but it was just how you justified it was different.
Absolutely. And we had observers in Kashmir until a Labour foreign minister, Bill Hayden, pulled them out in 1985. So they were there for over 30 years.
Yeah, that is, I mean, quite extraordinary. I think, was it only to be beaten by our contribution to Cyprus, which I think ended up being almost 60 years. Was that right?
Yeah, Cyprus went from 1964 to 2017, so that is 57 years, I think. But there is another operation which we've been in ever since 1956, and we're still in it, and that is the United Nations Truce Supervision Organization, or UNTSO, in Israel and its neighbours.
Of course.
So it's worth talking about that. I've never been able to find out exactly why we joined UNTSO. I've done research on this, but it must be in some file. But UNTSO was set up in 1948 after the first war between Israel and its neighbours, immediately after Israeli independence. And basically they were military observers who monitored the ceasefire lines, originally between Israel and Egypt, Jordan, Syria and Lebanon. So we joined it in 1956, before the Suez Crisis. I used to think perhaps it was connected with the Suez Crisis, but it's not. I think we just joined it because we'd just been elected to the Security Council for the second time. So, and that's interesting that even though the government is somewhat less interested in the United Nations, we're actually quite keen still to be a member of the Security Council. And it was actually our second term on the Security Council.
It's not elected either to the Security Council. I mean, maybe it was easier back then, but
there are a lot more members now, so it's harder now. But yeah, it shows actually real enthusiasm for the UN. But of course, some of that may have come out of the Department of External Affairs itself. And External Affairs could be quite a powerful repository of multinationalism and multilateralism, I really mean. And there are people in the department who have been heavily involved in the Evatt era, and so they may have shared some of those ideals. The interesting case then is when we go into Cyprus. And Cyprus, as you said, we were there for a long, long time, from 64 to 2017. But the government actually didn't want to go into Cyprus at all. The United Nations set up a peacekeeping mission there in 1964, 4 years after Cypriot independence. And Cyprus had gained independence from the British with a rather complicated constitution, which tried to guarantee rights for the Turkish minority. So the population was substantially Greek, and a lot of those Greeks had wanted unification with Greece. And then there was an 18% minority of ethnically Turkish people. And so it was always a complicated situation. Things got rather chaotic, and the UN set up a peacekeeping mission in 1964 and immediately asked Australia if we would contribute some troops. They really wanted Australian soldiers there. And the government just was not interested at all. By 1964, we were very worried about Indonesian confrontation. So we're very wary about sending troops back to the Mediterranean. The government didn't want to send troops, and in the end, that answer went back to the UN. Okay, we can't send troops. Then the UN decided that had in the Congo, where Australia only had a very few people, it was an enormous UN operation, 20,000 men, but very small Australian contribution indeed. But they wanted some civilian police, which they'd tried in the Congo and it worked, so they wanted them in Cyprus. So they came back to Australia and said, how about sending us some civilian police? And again, the government said no. But this time, some of the officers in the Department of External Affairs itself decided to fight a rearguard action and say, no, we really can't keep saying no to the UN like this. And yeah, we understand we don't want to send troops when we're worried about Indonesia. And of course, this is only a year before we end up in Vietnam, which was also an insurance policy about Indonesia in some ways. So the same arguments don't apply for the police. So a guy in particular, a First Assistant Secretary called Patrick Shaw, argued really strongly there are all sorts of reasons why we should show willing. Cyprus actually is quite important because of the Eastern Mediterranean and all our trade going through there. It's a Commonwealth country, which I guess was designed to appeal to Menzies. But also the arguments were about supporting the UN. If we want influence over the future of peacekeeping, and by now they were calling it peacekeeping, we need to show that we're willing to contribute. And if we want, and he explicitly made this argument, if one day we want the UN to get involved if there's conflict with Indonesia over Malaysia, over confrontation, we need to show that we support the UN and we're willing to go and help the UN in other places. And interestingly, he raised a very explicit argument, which is, I think, an ongoing debate, but has been won by the other side by now. He argued it is better general policy for us to contribute peacekeepers in distant parts of the world where we don't have our own immediate interests, and for other people to contribute peacekeepers in our own region. And that way, that maintains the neutrality.
Yeah. And of course, as you say, that's quite different to what we see these days, we'd say in Solomon Islands or Timor-Leste, where we're absolutely neighbours and have a lot of interest in those two countries. But it does make sense, sort of theoretically. You couldn't have too many dogs in the fight in Cyprus, you're so far away, although we would have had a lot of Cypriots in Australia coming as migrants.
Indeed.
But we could participate as neutral observers. And the interesting thing, though, Peter, is we're moving from the military observers, so people who've come out of the armed forces, who are going to, for example, the Middle East, to Israel, to Kashmir, and, of course, into Indonesia as people who are experienced in military operations and able to report on what's going on, to sending civilian police who have a very different sort of training. The nature of their work is quite different. So was that an evolution, do you think, of our peacekeeping missions?
It was an evolution of our peacekeeping, certainly. And after that, we had police in a lot of missions. So it became quite an Australian specialty in a way. But it was also an evolution of UN peacekeeping, that they had seen, soldiers are very good at doing some things, and obviously they can come armed. Either they can be observers, and often the observers are unarmed, or they can come as a force, which they were in Cyprus, and because they're armed, they can actually oppose any attempts to start fighting. But the feeling was they may not be the best people for dealing with civilians, and so the police were there to deal more directly with the civilian population, and also in particular to monitor the activities of both. There was a Greek Cypriot police force and a Turkish Cypriot police force. There are two separate entities. And our police could go and monitor their approaches, what they did at roadblocks, how they treated people, how they interrogated people, those sorts of things. So they didn't have any formal powers. They couldn't arrest people, but they were experienced police who could make sure that both sides understood that they were being watched and to try to quell the abuses of power, which were certainly going on a lot. So I think they've filled a very, very valuable role, and all UN missions now include police as well as military.
It's interesting that our early peacekeeping missions aren't very commonly known. People who have an interest in peacekeeping will be able to quickly point to, the Solomons and the East Timor mission, and that were, of course, incredibly high profile. And I think there's an element of pride in what Australia participated in and helped bring about, and of course Cambodia too. But those early missions are pretty low profile. Do you think that is because it reflected, say, the nature of the Menzies government's commitment to the UN and liberal internationalism, and so it was downplaying the importance of those missions? Or were there just other distractions that were much more high profile? Because, well, I mean, we found here in our own research, it's quite hard to find material on what the government ministers and Robert Menzies were saying about these missions. It's almost not in the records, which seems extraordinary because we were investing Australian personnel and resources in these missions. So you'd think it would have been pertinent to public debates, but not the case as far as we've found.
No, it didn't really hit public debate very much in those days, partly because small groups of officers who were being sent, it wasn't like sending a big contingent somewhere. And I think when we sent originally, the initial contingent in Cyprus was 40 police, and that did get some amount of media coverage because suddenly, we're sending this whole unit of police somewhere. With the observers in places like Indonesia and Kashmir and the Middle East with UNTSO, they so much went off as individuals and got attached to the UN that there seems to have been very little Australian awareness of them. During the 1973 war in the Middle East, it was discovered that we actually had no way in Australia of knowing. We wanted to know whether our peacekeepers were safe, and we had no direct way of knowing where they were at that time. There was no, I think later they did make more formal reporting back to Australia, but really we just put people on a plane and said, okay, you're off to join the UN now. We paid their salary, but that was about it. But it just, I think it's really sad that those early missions are so forgotten. The fact that we were engaged with the UN from such an early stage, and the fact that in Indonesia in particular, we actually were part of a group who made a difference. And we listed earlier some of the unsuccessful UN missions, but Indonesia was a success. The UN in Indonesia helped negotiate independence for Indonesia in December 1949. So actually that's a great success for the UN. I think Australians got very distracted by things like the Korean War and then later the Malayan Emergency, Vietnam. And it's a sad fact, and I do blame this mainly on the ancient Greeks actually, we find war so fascinating.
Yes,
we're just fascinated by people fighting wars. Yeah, it makes for good reading. And what peacekeepers do is enormously valuable, but it's at a sort of low-key level, which doesn't sound so exciting. Yet I've interviewed lots of peacekeepers and they have amazing stories to tell about what they're doing. And because they are doing things at that sort of granular level at the coalface, they're dealing with local problems and preventing local conflict, helping local communities out, and they're doing just amazing things. And it's a pity that it's not more understood, I think. But we had 2 observers with a mission in Korea in 1950, just before the start of the Korean War. And they were important, actually. They did a tour of the line between North and South Korea, and it was their report which made the UN Security Council confident that the Korean War was started by North Korea and not by South Korea, because actually at the time that wasn't totally clear. Before this happened, though, Australia had been asked, the UN had said to Australia, well, this is great, you've sent these 2 observers, but could we have one more observer and a more senior person, perhaps a brigadier or something, who will be the commander of all the UN observers in Korea? So quite a prestigious appointment.
Yeah. And these are, of course, military people, as you...
Military,
as they were in the early stages. Yeah.
So this came through External Affairs and they put it to the Department of Defence, and the Defence's answer was, no, we can't spare any military officers. Sorry, we're too stretched. We can't spare these people. And so basically Australia said, no, we can't send these 2 extra observers. And then the war started, and suddenly it was a Cold War conflict, communists versus non-communists. And altogether, I think 17,000 Australians fought in Korea. So as soon as it was war, the government said, right, we'll throw resources at it. But while it was just peacekeeping and trying to avoid a war, they were very reluctant.
And do you think that was the mindset of Department of Defence? They've come out of World War II. It's been all about the battles, the war, military engagement. To be sending people who are no doubt very tired and they're trying to demobilise as many people as they can, to be sending military people to something that might come to nothing or might be a war but might come to nothing, just seems like not the best use of resources at a time when they were really trying to they
were stretched for funding and they were trying to demobilise people, And that's true, but I think it's a misjudgment in that case, and it's sad that they thought that way. because, there was a real opportunity to do something. And for a long, long time, in fact, once we were in Korea, most of our military observers in places like Kashmir and the Middle East were reserve officers. They weren't very often regular army officers. And that changed quite suddenly around the mid-70s when we were out of Vietnam, and suddenly the regular army thought, we don't have anything to do now.
Right.
And so they all got very keen to go on peacekeeping missions. And so the reserve officers got pushed to one side, and after that it was mainly regular officers who did it.
We're obviously extending beyond the Menzies era into the 70s, but this is where you do see Australian peacekeeping changing quite a bit and how we conceptualise of it. And as you say, we're actually serving military officers and soldiers into peacekeeping missions as opposed to reservists. So, Department of Defence's attitude is changing, the government's attitude is changing. Is that as simple as it was the end of the Liberal government after 23 years in 72 and Whitlam came in and he had a different way of conceiving of the role of the UN and the role of Australia in that international system?
It's partly that. Whitlam was an enthusiast for the United Nations and went and spoke to the General Assembly and basically said, we want to be the first people asked for peacekeepers whenever you have need.
Here. Wish Australia to be always among the First Nations from which the United Nations would ask for peacekeeping forces. We shall be among the first to respond.
Yeah, and he meant that. It was very heartfelt, I think, and it just happened that there weren't many opportunities in his 3 years in office to do it. But some of that did carry over. So offers which had been made by him, there was a thing called the United Nations Emergency Force set up after the 1973 Middle East War. And Australia was very keen to supply troops to that, but that was under Whitlam. In the end, it's always a problem for the UN. They always have to produce a force which has a balance of military capabilities that they need, but also a political balance. If you talk to Australian peacekeepers, they often are critical of other countries' peacekeepers, but we just cannot have a situation where peacekeeping forces are sort of made up of sort of white Western armies. So it has to be a broad-based thing politically. But anyway.
And why is that? I mean, it might be an obvious answer.
Because the UN has to, the UN has to be seen as representing the whole world. It cannot, although any of the principles in the Charter are basically white Western principles, and that gets criticised, especially today, by people like Russia and China and so forth, do rightly say, well, so for these liberal internationalism is basically a Western construct. So, but still, the UN
still
has
have a permanent seat in the UN Security
Council. They do, and they're not giving that up.
So. No, exactly. So I'd be interested in seeing how they suggest that the rules should be rewritten.
Well, quite. Well, that's a big discussion for another day, I think. But the UN just has to appear as the representative of the world community, and that is its strength. That's the one great strength the UN has. The UN is not a rich organisation in terms of its funding. It's actually tiny compared to all the big powers around. But it's got a moral authority which counts for a lot. And it's why when UN peacekeepers do occasionally act badly, that's a real problem, because the UN exists on the basis of its moral authority. But that has to be an authority partly based on being seen to represent the broad range of countries. There are almost 200 members of the UN, so they all have to be represented. But we ended up in the force anyway, but under Malcolm Fraser. So Malcolm Fraser inherited a commitment made by the Whitlam government to provide what turned into helicopters in the Sinai in the late 70s. But Malcolm Fraser also got us especially into a mission, or a couple of missions, in southern Rhodesia after the Lancaster House Accords in 1979. We contributed to a thing called the Commonwealth Monitoring Force, which basically is one of the most amazing peacekeeping operations we've ever done. They had to supervise the cantonment of thousands and thousands of Patriotic Front guerrilla fighters and also monitor the Rhodesian security forces, who are the forces of the white Rhodesian government, in the lead up to elections in early 1980. An astonishing operation, actually, and I believe probably the most dangerous operation Australian peacekeepers have ever been in. We've been super lucky. Only less than around a dozen Australian peacekeepers have actually died, but Rhodesia or Zimbabwe was a dangerous one.
Yeah, it's amazing looking at the figures of the peacekeepers who have died. And, I mean, it's very sad that anyone dies in these operations, but when you look at the cause of death is almost all not related to a combat situation. It does seem to be misadventure or other sort of more personal reasons. So
a lot, though, I mean, peacekeepers theoretically won't be involved in fighting, or as little as possible, but they are operating in dangerous environments. One of our peacekeepers, Peter McCarthy, was killed in southern Lebanon by a landmine. He drove over a landmine, and in fact, we had a policeman in Cyprus also killed by a landmine in 1974. So they are operating in dangerous environments, and sometimes it's death by misadventure.
Yes, vehicle accidents and the like.
Yeah.
Peter, how successful has our peacekeeping been, do you think, after, and I haven't got the figure in front of me, how many years is it? It's almost 80 years, isn't it? It's 77 years.
77 years, yeah. I think it's been, it's been mixed in terms of overall success. And part of the problem is ultimately the peacekeepers can't make peace. They can keep peace while the diplomats and the politicians make peace. The peacekeepers' job isn't to enforce a peace settlement. That has to be negotiated. And people do forget that. And they often say, well, why can't the UN be more successful? But the UN also is a club of powers. And some of those powers, especially the permanent 5 members of the Security Council, throw their weight around. And so it can be very difficult for the United Nations itself to solve conflicts. We've been, I think, involved in perhaps 4 or 5 truly successful peacekeeping operations. And it's important to remember that. Indonesia, you have to count as a success because the aim was to sort out a conflict between the colonial power and the local people who wanted independence. It got sorted out and Indonesia became an independent state without bloodshed. There were bits of bloodshed. The Dutch mounted 2 so-called police actions, but basically very little fighting. And so that's a success. Cambodia, I think overall is a success story, but also Rhodesia or Zimbabwe is a success story. In Zimbabwe, the job was to maintain peace between the 2 groups who had just been fighting a civil war for 10 years and a very, very brutal civil war for long enough to hold free elections. They held free elections. Everybody knew, and I've talked to senior British Army officers and so forth, and they all knew Mugabe would win that election because he represented the dominant tribal group. And because politics were operating along those tribal lines, he was always going to win. So that's democracy. Mugabe may have turned out to be a very bad leader, but our job was to help Zimbabwe become an independent country with free and fair elections to start it off. That was the job, and we succeeded in that. Cambodia, similarly, the democracy hasn't always been perfect, but we did, after a long period of first genocide under Pol Pot, then a long period of occupational puppet state under the Vietnamese and factional fighting and so forth, with the Khmer Rouge still a factor. Under John Sanderson, who was the UN force commander in Cambodia, the UN force succeeded in calming things down enough to hold free elections in which the vast majority of Cambodians voted. So that was a successful outcome. And whether we like Cambodian politics now or not is a matter for the Cambodians. East Timor, after a very shaky start, after the referendum in East Timor, the UN was totally unprepared. The UN had an unarmed group there to handle the referendum itself, which had a substantial Australian component, and they were not prepared for the violence which the militia in East Timor launched after that referendum. And so it took time.
An intelligence failure?
I think it's a political failure, and I think it's a failure which is actually quite embarrassing to Australia still. There's now an official history being written of East Timor, which the government would never let us include it now. We asked several times to include East Timor in our multi-volume history of Australian peacekeeping, and the government would never agree. And it's now been included in a new official history of East Timor, Iraq, and Afghanistan. And they've had enormous problems getting the 2 volumes on East Timor cleared. In fact, one is still in the pipeline, and wanted to cut out a lot of stuff because I think Australia is a bit embarrassed about its own role in East Timor, its sort of complicity with the Indonesians. We were very, very reluctant to do anything which could offend Indonesia. And trouble was you actually needed to be fairly firm with the Indonesians because the militia who launched the violence in East Timor were mainly based, they came out of West Timor, part of Indonesia. So the UN failed at that point, but then authorised Australia to mount an Operation Interfet, and that was basically highly successful in ending the fighting and setting East Timor up. And then there was a series of further UN operations. So basically East Timor, I'd say, is a success story. And Bougainville also before that, earlier than that, after a long secessionist movement and civil war led by the New Zealanders. Australia always likes to remember our role, but the New Zealanders actually took the lead role first because they're actually more acceptable to the Bougainvilleans than Australia was. Australia was seen as being, we'd actually supplied some of the helicopters that the Papua New Guinea Defence Force used to drop some of their opponents out of over the sea and that sort of thing. So we were seen as a bit too close to Papua New Guinea. And in the end, Australia could take a leading role.
This speaks to that evolution of peacekeeping forces from being distant to the conflict to actually being very proximate and invested in the conflict.
Yeah.
In terms of being close neighbours or...
Yeah, and that's been the huge shift. The comparison there is with the 90s in the sort of the era when Gareth Evans was Minister for Foreign Affairs and clearly believed, like Everett, that he should be solving every conflict in the world and did a huge amount in places like Cambodia. Australia took a really leading role in the settlement in Cambodia, but also we're doing peacekeeping in Western Sahara, Somalia and Rwanda. So, not always successfully, but can I get back to your original question about how successful it's been?
Very quickly.
You have to? Okay. Sometimes you look at an operation and say, well, that wasn't a success. And Somalia is probably a good case of that. But in fact, the Australian 1st Battalion of the Royal Australian Regiment in Baidoa, in Somalia in early 1993 was hugely successful in ending fighting and protecting the distribution of humanitarian aid. And they really went above and beyond. The battalion was commanded by our current Governor General, and they really did a good job of sorting that area out. The sad thing then, I think, is that Australia, when the UN wanted us to replace it with another battalion, well, not the UN, well, it would have been, it's a bit complicated. It was a US-led operation, but then the UN was taking over again. They wanted Australia to continue, and we said, no, we were only promised 4 months, so that's going to be it. So I think sometimes Australia could have done more, and we've been a bit reluctant to go the extra mile sometimes. And that, I think, is what's good about East Timor, that we stayed the course there. We did it partly because it was in our own region, so we thought it was important to us, but we didn't just say, and in the 90s, everybody talked about the exit strategy. How do we get out? Because they looked at places like Kashmir or UNTSO or these ones which had gone on for decades, and they didn't want to get embroiled in that. But peacekeeping often needs the long haul. You just don't sort out a society which has been in conflict for a long time in a couple of months.
And Cyprus, Israel, Kashmir are still going, and the peacekeepers are still needed. Peter, thank you so much for bringing to light all that really important history of Australia's peacekeeping from those early years in the 40s and 50s and 60s through to current day. Quite an extraordinary transformation when you look at it in that bigger picture. And of course, we'll be interested to observe the next, as sad as it may be, because conflict is, as you know from your studies of ancient Greece, conflict will be with us into the future as it has in the past. So no doubt the role for peacekeepers will still be pertinent and evolving too. So thank you. That's it for this week's episode of Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute. Please make sure to subscribe and catch up on our latest online content on our website or on Twitter, LinkedIn or Facebook.